In order to talk about dates in Spanish, it's important to know the numbers 1 through 31. Here are those numbers, and if you need to pause the video and write these down, you can. However, I would say that if you haven't already gone through the numbers tutorial, it would probably be a good idea to do that now. It's also obviously very important to know the names of the months. So here's a list of the months in Spanish. Notice that these are not capitalized. In Spanish, months are not capitalized, even though in English they are. So the months of the year are enero, febrero, marzo, abril, mayo, junio, julio, agosto, septiembre, octubre, noviembre, and diciembre. Most of these are pretty recognizable. They're mostly very close to the English names of the months, the only exception maybe being enero, which is somewhat similar but not really very similar. In English, when we talk about dates, we would usually say something like January 15th, August 21st, and so forth. In Spanish, there are a couple of things to remember. First, we need to remember that in Spanish, the number comes before the month. Second, we should realize that in English we use ordinal numbers to give dates. For instance, we may not write it this way, but we would say the 4th of September, or the 18th, or whatever. We have the th, the st, that type of thing as a part of the number. In Spanish, we don't do that. We just use the cardinal numbers, your regular uno, dos, tres, and so forth, with the exception of 1, which we'll talk about shortly. So keeping those things in mind, let's look at some examples. In English, we might say June 6th. We write it like this, but we say June 6th. In Spanish, we would say el 6 de junio. Chances are we wouldn't really write it that way. Chances are we would write it el 6 de junio. But for the purposes of learning to say it, we might write out the name of the number. So again, those two things I mentioned. 1, the number comes before the month. 2, we do just use the regular number, the cardinal number, not the ordinal number. So that makes it a little bit easier. And also, as I mentioned at the beginning, notice that the name of the month is not capitalized. Here we see some examples, again written out in long form. El 23 de agosto, you should be able to figure out if you know your months and numbers, is August 23rd. El 7 de marzo, March 7th, el 15 de febrero, February 15th. It's a pretty easy thing to get down. There is one little exception, and I did mention it a minute ago, and that's with the first of each month. Instead of saying the 1 of October, for instance, they will say the first of. So you do need to know that word, and it is primero. So we say el primero de octubre in this case. Of course, it could be any month, el primero de septiembre, el primero de enero, or whatever the case may be. Just a couple of reminders. Don't forget el, especially when you're speaking. El means the. Then we have the number. Then we have de, which means of, and then the month. All of those are important elements. Now, when the date is written in short form using just numbers, they are still going to put the date first before the month. So the day of the month before the name of the month. That's opposite of how we typically do it in English. So in English we might see a date written like this, 6/25, and we know that that's June 25th, but in Spanish it's going to be written the other way around. The 25 or 25 would come first, the 6 would come afterward. The same would go if we had the year. We might see an 11 there, or maybe even 2011. In Spanish, the year will come at the end, but remember that the day of the month comes first, then the number for that specific month, then the year. This becomes especially important in this case. It's easy enough to figure out because there's not a 25th month. But if you saw this, your first inclination would be to think, oh, well, that's May 4th. But if you saw this in Spanish, this is not May 4th, it's April 5th, the 5th of April 2011. So a few things that we have to keep in mind, but overall it's a pretty simple, straightforward system and not a whole lot different than what we're used to in English.